In 2014, time meeting in an office space in London's Me Late, historiographer Kim Wagner acquired an electronic mail of a pair who told they belonging a cranium. Dr. Wagner, who teaches Empire Story at Tsarina Mary College of London, says the pair said him they did not sense convenient in the item in their building, and did not aware which to do in it. The reduced jaw of the cranium was lacking, the few left gearing were friable, and it had the cuttlefish hue of old year. But which was wonderful was a comprehensive handwriting mention in a carefully stacked slide of document plugged in an eye outlet. The mention said the short history of the cranium of Havildar Alam Beg, 46th Regiment. Bengali N troop who was blown up off of a cannon, among several other of his regiment. He was a main lead in the rebellion of 1857 and of a largest ruffianly propensity. He took ownership, at the chief of a little side, of the way guideline to the fortress, to that location all the Europeans were hastening for security. His side amazed and annihilated Dr. Graham survey him in his badgie by the party of his child. His following sacrifice was the turnover. Mr. Bounty Hunter, a missioner, who was flyer in his woman and daughters in the identical line. He killed Mr. Bounty Hunter, and his woman and daughters following creature savagely purified were butchered by the way party. Alam Beg was on 32 year of year, 5 feet 7 1/2 inches top and by no tool an ill-looking home. The cranium was driven household by skipper, A.R. Costello, deceased Captain 7th Pole Guard, who was on responsibility while Alam Beg was executed. Which was precise of the mention was how the cranium was of a insurgent Hindu man named Alam Beg, who belonged to the Bengali regiment and who was executed in 1858 by creature blown up of the jaw of a gun in Sialkot, a city in Punjab provincial arranged in this day Pakistan, and how a man who observed the implementation driven the cranium to England. The mention is quiet on why Beg devoted the estimated murders. Home Indian and Muslim soldiers, as well named as sepoys, rebelled versus the UK East India business in 1857 above fears how gun cartridges were oiled in pet fat prohibited by their confessions. The UK controlled India for 200 years before the nation's autonomy in 1947. The pair in Essex had trawled the web and unsuccessful to discover whatever on Beg. They contacted Dr. Wagner following they found his behalf as a historiographer who had authored a volume on the Hindu rebellion, frequently called to as the at first War of Autonomy. On a wet November date, that was as well his date of birth, Dr. Wagner met the pair. They said him how they had legacied the cranium following one of their loved ones took above a pub in Kent named the Lord Clyde in 1963, and found the cranium saved by several old crates and boxes in a little chamber in the behind of the house. No rather knows how the cranium ended up in the public house. The regional print had with emotion informed on the nervous system shattering opening in 1963 and transferred pictures of the new pub owners majestically posing in the horrific prize up. It was put up on screen at the public house. While the owners dead, it was eventually gone on to their loved ones who just hit it off. Or so it was. I found myself permanent in a little boat train plant in Essex in a humane cranium in my pouch. Not fair any some cranium but one immediately associated to a portion of story how I compose on and how I learn my students each year, says Dr. Wagner. Which was really precise, he says, is how it was a prize cranium, irretrievably related to a story of abuse. But at first Dr. Wagner had to prove how the cranium matched the story set out in the mention, spelled by an unidentified man. At London's Nature Story Museum, an specialist discussed it and offered how it dated back behind to the medium 19th age, and how it certainly belonged to a man of Asiatic origin, who was perhaps in his medium 30s. Down there was no mark of abuse, told the specialist. That is not extraordinary in the instance of implementation by gun, wherever the body conducted the complete effect of the explosion. The cranium as well drill cut symbolism of a instrument, offering how the chief was defleshed by creature cooked or creature leftward vulnerable to insects. Dr. Wagner says he did not trust once how it would be probable to discover out really lot more than on Beg. Person soldiers seldom leftward any traces in the colonialist archive, in the probable exclusion of Hulov Mangal Pandey, who fired the at first shooting at a UK official on March 29, 1857 on the suburb of Kolkata and mixed up a wavelength of uprising in India versus the colonialist force. Beg's behalf was not aforementioned in any of the documents, accountable, letters, memoirs and test accounting records of the time in the archive and libraries in India and UK. Down there were as well no descendants needing the back of the cranium. But down there were a few useful show. Dr. Wagner found the letters of Beg's estimated victims to their families. Which proven key, he says, in piecing the history along were the letters and memoirs of an US missioner, Andrew Gordon, who lived in Sialkot for and following the rebellion. He knew both of Dr. Graham and the hunting, Beg's victims, individually, and he had visited the man's implementation. Down there was as well a demonstration paper in the pictorial paper, The Field, in 1911 on a horrific artifact in a museum in Whitehall. The terrible souvenir of the Hindu rebellion has, we are aware, been located in the Museum of the King Joint Facility Establishment at Whitehall. It is a cranium of a sepoy of the 49th Regiment of Bengali troop who was blown up of the guns in 1858 in 18 other. The cranium has been transformed in a sig box as we view. The paper told how time we may be capable to know all the wildness of the horrible period, the brutality of the natives and the brutal vengeance how accompanied. Is it not an indignation how a souvenir of our vengeance, that in these days would not be admitted for a time, should be located on trade show in a large social establishment? Struggling a hunger of testimony, Dr. Wagner began investigation Beg. He treated in the archive in London and Delhi, and passing to Sialkot to place the neglected battleground of the 4 persons day Trimugat collision in July 1857, for that the Sialkot mob, consisting Beg, were intercepted and conquered by a General Nicholson. He relied on letters, petitions, proclamations and statements by mob following the outburst of the rebellion, went comprehensive 19th age paper databases and scan books. It was just following I consumable several period investigation the history, in the UK and in India, how I controlled to chunk a historic story along and implemented how down there was a greater history to speak, he said me. The outcome is Wagner's new volume, The Cranium of Alam Beg, a bright web page turner on lifetime and die in UK India for the greatest against colonial uprising of the 19th age. Yasmin Khan, Connect Prof of Story at the College of Oxford, says the volume reads love a detective story Roman and yet is as well an essential deposit to insight UK guideline and the degree of colonialist abuse. Dr. Wagner writes how his volume sets out to recover several of the humanist and virtue how has been rejected to Alam Beg by expressive the history of his lifetime and die for one of the largest drama episodes in the story of UK India. I expect I include produced the land for Alam Beg to eventually discover several 160-year deceased. In Dr. Wagner's expressive, Alam Beg, correctly transliterated as Alam Beg, was a Sunnite Muslim of northern India. The Bengali regiment was grown in Kanpur, currently Kanpur, in present Uttar Pradesh country, and it is potential how Beg vaunted of the area. Muslim done up about 20% of the substantially Indian regiments. Beg was accountable for a little emotio of soldiers, and had a exhausting usual, protecting the camping, transport letters and work as a farm laborer for high officials of the regiment. Following the uprising in July 1857, he emerging to include evaded the UK military before his seize and implementation almost a year after. Skipper Costello, who was outlined as creature this at the implementation in the mention, was set as Robert George Costello. Dr. Wagner believes he is the man who driven the cranium behind to Britain. He was unborn in Ireland and shipped to India in 1857, and retired of his committee 10 months after, boarded up a steamship of India in October 1858, and achieved Southampton a slight more than rather than a monthly after. This definitive aim of my study is to get ready for Beg to be repatriated to India, if at all probable, Dr. Wagner says. He says down there include been no claims to the cranium, but same's in concern in Hindu institutions, and the UK top committee in India is as well implicated in the original discussions. I am really acute for Alam Beg's repatriate not to be politicized, and for the cranium not to end up in a window case in a museum or just be neglected in a box sometime, says Dr. Wagner. My expect is for Alam Beg to be repatriated and buried in a polite way in the close next. A fit location to bury it, Beg, he believes, would be on the Isle on the Ravi inland, wherever the sepoy and his comrade soldiers had undertaken shelter following surviving the at first day of the fight, and that present symbolism the boundary among India and Pakistan. Eventually, how is not for me to solve, but everything happens, the definitive head of Alam Beg's history has yet to be spelled. Photographic politeness, Kim Wagner.